Terran command draws the line, the Galactic Empire is forbidden to cross. The alien was still talking. That was the first thing I noticed, not its three-jointed hands laid flat on the conference table, not the faint chemical smell it carried like a signature, not even the way it sat perfectly still while it delivered what was, by any reasonable definition, a death sentence for the human race. I noticed that it had been talking for 11 minutes without pausing for breath, because whatever Secundus Orvain used for lungs apparently did not require the same maintenance ours did. I was not listening. I was watching Admiral Leonard Cole. Cole was 62 years old, built like someone had assembled him from surplus spacecraft parts and then forgot to soften the edges. He had a coffee cup in front of him that had gone cold 40 minutes ago. He had not moved. He had not blinked at an unusual rate. He had the specific, cultivated stillness of a man who had spent 4 decades deciding which things were worth reacting to. Orvain finished. The room held its breath. Cole said, "No." One word. Clean as a door closing. Orvain did not move either. That was the thing about the Veth Conclave's representatives, they were trained to project inevitability. Every motion, every pause, every carefully modulated sentence was designed to make you feel that resistance was a mistake you were making in real time. Orvain was very good at his job. He said, "Admiral, I want to be certain the translation matrix is functioning correctly. You understand what I have presented?" "I do," Cole said. "Cede the Outer Rim territories. Dismantle the Ares-class fleet. Accept provisional protectorate status within 14 standard cycles." Orvain's voice carried no emotion, which was itself a kind of emotion. "These are not suggestions." "I know what they are," Cole said. "Then your response is no." I had been sitting at the far end of the table for the full duration of this meeting. Strategic liaison. My job was to observe, document, and advise. My job was not to reach across the polished surface of Conference Room 7 and pick up one of the stylus pens sitting in the center tray. I did it anyway. Nobody looked at me. Orvain was focused on Cole. The 12 other officers in the room were focused on Orvain. I turned the pen over in my fingers, standard issue, military gray, the kind that left ink on your palm if you held it too long, and I listened to the rest of the meeting with something that was not quite calm but occupied the same neighborhood. Orvain spent the next 9 minutes explaining what no would cost. He was thorough. He mentioned the Drenethi by name, which was a specific choice. The Drenethi were the 17th civilization the Veth Conclave had dissolved, and Orvain used the word dissolved the way a chemist uses it, precise, technical, indicating a process that is complete and irreversible. He mentioned the Leth Confederation, the Auras Compact, 2 other civilizations that no longer existed as civilizations. He mentioned the composition of the Conclave fleet that would respond if Terran Command maintained its current position. He mentioned your kind in reference to how Terrans processed strategic decisions. A shorthand. A categorization. The room shifted. I felt it, 12 officers recalibrating, the temperature of the air changing by some degree that had nothing to do with climate control. A few of them straightened. One of them, Captain Neil Rowe sitting 3 seats to my left, put his hands flat on the table. I was already somewhere else. Not the room. Not the meeting. For approximately 4 seconds I was on Kepler Station, and the sound was different, and the outcome had not been different, and then I was back in Conference Room 7 with the pen in my hand and anger moving through me like something warm and familiar and mine. I used the anger to come back. That was what it was for. Orvain finished his second presentation. He folded his 3-jointed hands with the patience of something that had never needed to hurry. He said, "I will await your formal response." 14 cycles. Cole said, "You will have it." The meeting ended. People filed out. Cole caught my eye across the table, not a question, just an acknowledgement, and then he left too. I sat for a moment in the empty room. The pen was still in my hand. Standard issue, military gray. I looked at it. I did not put it back in the center tray. I put it in my jacket pocket. Outside, in the corridor, I watched Orvain's diplomatic shuttle lift off through the reinforced viewport. It was a beautiful piece of engineering, smooth and absolutely sure of itself, rising without hurry. 14 cycles. I had been given less before and done more with it. I went to find Cole. He was already in the war room, standing at the central display with a fresh cup of coffee, still hot this time, looking at a star map of the Outer Rim territories that Orvain had, in his careful language, recommended we relinquish. 23 settled colonies. 4 million people. 11 years of infrastructure development. You are keeping the pen, Cole said without turning around. It is a nice pen. He turned around. Up close, Cole looked older than he did in briefings. Not weaker, just more certain of exactly how much things cost. How long before they move? If they follow standard conclave protocol, and they will, because they always do, 10 cycles of positioning, 2 cycles of final offer, then engagement at cycle 14 if we have not responded. We are going to respond. I know. Just not the way they want. I did not answer that. He knew I knew. He was not asking me. He looked back at the star map. The Outer Rim territories glowed soft orange on the display, 23 small lights representing 4 million people who were currently, at this exact moment, asleep or working or eating dinner and had no idea that a creature with 3 jointed hands had just quietly offered their lives as a negotiating position. I need you to write the line, Cole said. I had been waiting for that. Yes, sir. Coordinates, language, broadcast parameters. The full protocol. Understood. He looked at me then. Really looked, the way he did when he was deciding how much honesty the moment required. Yael. This is the kind of thing that does not have a good outcome. It only has outcomes that are better than other outcomes. I know what it is, I said. He nodded. He believed me. He should have. I had seen the worst version of this particular kind of moment, and I was still standing in front of him, so clearly I had some working theory of how to survive it. I left him with his star map and his coffee and the weight of what no was about to become. The pen was in my pocket. I went to write the line. I started at 0300. Terminal 9 was the smallest workstation in Terran Command's strategic wing, 1 screen, 1 chair, 1 dead overhead light that nobody had replaced in 6 months. I had requested it specifically. I did not want company for this. The coffee was already cold by the time I sat down. I did not drink it. The line protocol had a template. Most critical military documents do, frameworks built by people who understood that when you are making the most important decision in the history of your civilization, you should not also be worrying about formatting. I opened the template. I looked at the blank coordinate fields. I started with the Outer Rim perimeter, the actual territorial boundary of Terran settled space, charted and documented and filed with 3 different galactic regulatory bodies who were currently, I was fairly certain, waiting to see what happened before deciding which side of this they stood on. The coordinates were precise. They had to be. A line that could be misread was not a line. It was an invitation to argue about where the line was, which was how disputes started over words instead of choices. I entered the first set of coordinates. Named the boundary point Kepler. Moved on. I named them all. The 14 primary points of the line stretched across the outer rim like a border drawn by someone who intended it to mean something. Not for the record. The record would show coordinates, not names. I named them for myself, and for the people who had earned the naming, and I did not write the names down anywhere that anyone would ever find them. That was enough. The language took longer than the coordinates. The Veth Conclave communicated in layered imperial, a language designed, as far as xenolinguists could determine, to make every statement sound like it had already been agreed to. The phrasing was dense with implication. A standard diplomatic communique from the conclave read like someone had taken a perfectly clear sentence and wrapped it in 4 additional sentences whose sole purpose was to make you feel that disagreeing was both futile and slightly embarrassing. I was not writing in layered imperial. I was writing in Universal Galactic Standard, which was the lingua franca of charted space and which had the particular virtue of being almost impossible to misinterpret. Flat, direct, stripped of ceremonial padding. The conclave found it inelegant. I found it honest. I wrote the core statement 3 times before I was satisfied. The first version was too long. The second version was accurate but cold in a way that read like fear. The third version was 11 sentences, each one doing exactly one thing, and the last sentence was something I had not been asked to write and which I wrote anyway. This line is not a negotiation. It is a fact. We are informing you of it as a courtesy. I read it back twice. Left it. At 0530, Captain Neil Rowe knocked on the frame of Terminal 9's open door. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee that were still steaming, which told me he had either been awake all night or had exceptional timing. Cole wants the draft by 0700, he said. He will have it by 0600. Rowe set one of the cups on the edge of the desk. He was not a man who performed emotions unnecessarily, which was one of the reasons I trusted him. He looked at the screen without reading it, or maybe he read it and was just good at pretending he had not. How bad is it? I looked at the coordinate display. 14 points of light marking the edge of everything humanity had built in the outer rim. 4 million people on the other side of a line I was drawing at 0530 in a room with a dead overhead light. It is what it is, I said. He nodded. He took his coffee and left. I finished the draft at 0547. Sent it to Cole. Sat back in the chair with my own coffee, still cold, and looked at the screen. The pen was on the desk. I had taken it out of my jacket pocket at some point during the night without remembering when. I picked it up. Turned it over. Standard issue, military gray. I put it back in my pocket. The War Council met at 1000. 16 people in a room designed for 10. Representatives from Earth Central Command, the Luna Authority, Mars Defense Council, and 3 Outer Rim settlement governments who had scrambled their fastest ships to get here in time to have a voice in this. They had earned their seats. Cole ran the meeting with the same stillness he had brought to Conference Room 7. He presented the line protocol, walked through the coordinates and the language and the broadcast parameters with the systematic care of a man who understood that every word he said in this room was going to be remembered. The debate was fast and ugly and honest. They have dissolved 17 civilizations, said Governor Petra Lane from the Callisto settlement, a woman in her 50s who had spent 30 years building something on a moon of Jupiter and was not interested in a diplomatic framing of what dissolution meant. 17. The Drenathi alone had 4 billion people. We are not the Drenathi, said Admiral Yusuf Adnan from Earth Central. He had a voice like something carved out of a mountain, not loud, just permanent. We do not know that yet, said Lane. A silence settled over the room. Not comfortable. The kind that meant everyone in it was running the same numbers and arriving at the same place and none of them wanted to be the first to say it out loud. Cole said it. We are about to find out. He looked around the table. The line goes out at 1400 hours. We are informing the conclave of a fact. We are not asking permission. We are not opening a negotiation. We are stating a boundary and making clear that we are prepared to enforce it. He paused. Objections go on the record. I will read every one of them. I will take none of them. No one objected. That was its own kind of answer. At 1357, I was standing in the broadcast chamber, a circular room at the center of Terran Command HQ, walls lined with transmission arrays, smelling of hot electronics and whatever the technicians used to clean the floors. Lieutenant Owen Park, 23 years old and 6 months out of the Mars Academy, was running the transmission board. He had the focused stillness of someone trying very hard not to look like he was frightened. He was doing a good job. Transmission ready, Commander, he said without looking up. All frequencies. Universal Galactic Standard. 40-second burst across all conclave accessible relay points. Thank you, Owen. He looked up then. Just for a moment. Is it going to work? That was not a question I had been asked to answer. It was also not a question with an answer I could give him, not honestly, not standing in a broadcast chamber 43 seconds before we did the most irreversible thing our species had ever done. We wrote a very clear document, I said. He held my eyes for a moment. Then he nodded and looked back at his board. At 1400 exactly, I read the line into the transmission array. My own voice, Cole's instruction. 14 coordinate sets, the legal framework, the enforcement declaration, and the last sentence that nobody had asked me to write. The green standby light on Owen's board blinked steadily through the full 40 seconds of transmission. I watched it. When it went solid, transmission complete, Owen exhaled. The technicians at the wall arrays began their post-transmission checks. Someone down the corridor said something that might have been a cheer. I stood still for another 10 seconds. Then I went back to my desk. The pen was in my pocket. I took it out, set it on the desk next to my cold coffee and my empty water glass, and I opened a new document on Terminal 9's screen. Somewhere out in charted space, 43 civilizations had just received what we sent. I wondered which ones laughed. I wondered, more carefully, which ones did not. The alert sounded at 0318. No warning. No build-up. Just sound, and then I was already moving. I had been asleep for approximately 90 minutes aboard the TSNS Meridian when the proximity alert cut through the dark of my bunk room like something with teeth. By the time the second tone finished, I was dressed. By the time the third tone finished, I was in the corridor. The bridge smelled like recycled air and burnt coffee and something ionized and wrong coming off the weapon arrays as they powered up. That last smell was new. I had not smelled it outside a drill before. It did not smell like a drill. Cole was already at the central display. He had not, as far as I could determine, slept at all. He was looking at the tactical readout with the same expression he used for everything, absolute stillness, like a calculation running at a depth most people could not see. 240 vessels, he said without turning around. Proxima threshold. They crossed the line 8 minutes ago. I looked at the display. 240 red markers sitting inside Terran sovereign space, sitting exactly on the coordinates I had entered into the line protocol 4 days ago in a room with a dead overhead light. I looked at our readout. 18 ships. I did not say the number out loud. Neither did Cole. The math was not a conversation worth having. The Meridian itself was a heavy carrier, largest ship in the Ares-class fleet, built for exactly this kind of moment and with slightly too few of this kind of moment having occurred before for us to know with certainty whether it was built well enough. Its crew of 412 people was currently doing their jobs with the focused, slightly over-controlled efficiency of people who understood that doing their jobs was the only thing standing between them and a thought they were not going to have yet. I took my station at the secondary tactical console. The pen was clipped to my breast pocket. Regulation violation. You were not supposed to clip personal items to uniform breast pockets, and nobody had said a word about it in 4 days. Orvain's voice came through the channel at 0341. It was not a surprise. It was, in fact, exactly what I had predicted to Cole 6 days ago in the war room. Almost to the minute, the conclave would cross, hold position, and then communicate, because this was still a demonstration, not an engagement. They wanted us to see the number. They wanted us to do the math and arrive at the reasonable conclusion. Terran Command, Orvain said. His voice carried the same flat precision I remembered from Conference Room 7. You have demonstrated intent. We have demonstrated capacity. There remains time to reconsider. No further action is required from either side. The bridge was very quiet. Cole looked at me. The plan had Cole responding with a prepared statement, measured, formal, citing the line protocol's legal framework and Terran Command's enforcement mandate. It was a good statement. I had read it. It said all the right things in all the right order. Cole looked at me and I understood, from the particular quality of his stillness, that he was giving me the channel. I crossed to the primary communications station. Owen Park, reassigned to the Meridian's bridge crew 4 days ago, looked up from his board. He was still 23. He was still trying not to look like he was frightened. He was still doing a good job. He opened the channel. I said, "You have been informed of the line. You are standing on it." 11 words. I had not planned them. They were simply the truest available sentence. A pause on Orvain's end. Long enough that I counted it. 7 seconds. Orvain was not a being that paused for 7 seconds unless the pause was intentional. Then he said, "Commander Morrow." He knew my name. Of course he did. The conclave was thorough. "I recognize you from the conference record. You were the officer who did not speak. I am speaking now." Another pause. Shorter. "So you are." A beat. "The line is a document. It has no material enforcement capacity against 240 vessels." "No," I said. "It does not." "Then." "It does not need one right now," I said. Right now it just needs to be a fact. And it is. The channel was quiet. On the display, the 240 red markers held their positions. Not advancing. Not withdrawing. Sitting on the line like a weight placed carefully on a scale, waiting to see which way it tipped. I watched the timestamp in the corner of the display. 0347, 0348, 0349. My hand was on the pen. I had not decided to put it there. It was just where my hand was. 0352, 0353. Cole was at my shoulder. Not close enough to interrupt, close enough to act if he needed to. Ro was at the weapons console with the careful posture of someone who has a decision to make and is waiting for the right moment. The rest of the bridge was a held breath. 0356. The red markers moved. Not forward. Back. A slow, deliberate repositioning, not a retreat. The conclave did not retreat. This was a withdrawal of their own choosing, a pulling back to the far side of the line specifically designed to communicate that they had chosen to withdraw and had not been pushed. The distinction mattered to them. I understood. I let them have it. The bridge exhaled. Not me. I stood at the communications station for another 30 seconds after the channel closed, watching the red markers settle into their new positions, 40 light minutes past the line, outside sovereign Terran space, regrouping. The tactical sensors caught the shadow of additional ships arriving at their position. New vessels. More weight. They would come back. This had been the question. The standoff had not been a battle, it had been a test, designed to answer one thing: would Terran Command hold an indefensible position against an overwhelming force purely because they had stated they would? Now the conclave knew the answer. Owen was looking at me from across the bridge. Not all of the crew, most of them were running their post-standoff checks. But Owen was looking at me, and 3 or 4 others were looking, and what was on their faces was something I did not have an immediate name for. Not celebration. Not relief. Something quieter and more careful than either. Cole put a hand briefly on my shoulder, 2 seconds, no more, and then he was already moving, already back to the central display, already recalculating. I went back to my station. At 0215, I wrote in the mission log, Conclave fleet withdrew to position 40 light minutes past line perimeter at 0356. Tactical sensors indicate reinforcement vessels arriving at their coordinates. Assessment: initial standoff was a probing action. Second contact is coming. They now know we hold. They will return with enough force that holding becomes a different kind of question. I stopped typing. Looked at the pen clipped to my pocket. We are good at this, I wrote. Then I left it. 72 hours after the Proxima standoff, 17 species sent contact requests to Terran Command. Not all of them were friendly. That was fine. Friendly was not the point. The point was that 17 civilizations with 17 different survival calculations had watched what happened at Proxima threshold and decided that whatever Terran Command was, it was worth paying attention to. Cole gave me the diplomatic brief on all 17 in a 40-minute meeting that morning. He went through each one with the same methodical clarity he brought to everything. Some were long-term conclave adjacent, meaning they operated in conclave-controlled space and could not afford open alliance but were quietly, tentatively, doing the political equivalent of putting a toe in the water. Some were genuinely neutral. Some were species the conclave had previously pressured, who recognized the current moment as a potential shift in a very old balance. And one was the Drenethi. Cole told me this last. He had a specific way of delivering significant information. He said it at a normal pace, in a normal tone, and then he stopped talking and let the weight of it find its own level. I sat with it for a moment. The Drenethi were the 17th civilization the Veth Conclave had dissolved. Were, past tense. They had been a civilization of 4 billion people spread across 6 inhabited systems, with a recorded history longer than humanity's written record. The dissolution had taken 11 years. What remained was a scattered population of approximately 800,000 individuals, living in fragment communities across the edges of charted space, stateless and without legal personhood under galactic imperial law because the state that had granted their personhood no longer existed. 800,000 people. Out of 4 billion. Cole said, their envoy's name is Sethek. They have requested a direct meeting with Terran Command's strategic leadership. I will take it, I said. He looked at me. Deciding something. You understand what that meeting is going to be? Yes. It is not going to be comfortable. No meetings worth having are, I said. He gave me the file and let me go. The meeting with the other 16 delegations came first, 2 days of back-to-back sessions, each one running at a different temperature, each one requiring different calibration. Governor Lane handled the Callisto settlement's diplomatic interactions with something between aggression and hope. Admiral Adnan handled the military alliance discussions with a steadiness I relied on. I handled the rest, the species assessments, the intelligence briefings, the careful work of reading which of the 17 were actually offering something and which were here to gather information and report back. It was exhausting in the specific way that work is exhausting when it matters too much to do carelessly. On the third day, I met Sethek. The conference room was small. I had requested something without the long formal table, just a round table, 2 chairs, a water dispenser. Sethek arrived with a single aide and sat down across from me without ceremony, which I appreciated. They were small by the standard of most species I had worked with, lean, gray-complexioned, with large eyes that processed light in 2 frequencies simultaneously, according to the briefing file. They wore the kind of clothing that had once been functional and was now, through long wear, simply familiar. The translator was on the table between us. Sethek had 8 working words of Universal Galactic Standard. The translator would handle the rest. Sethek looked at me for a moment before speaking. Not assessing. Something else. Something I recognized without being able to name. They said something to the translator, and the translator said, "You drew the line." "I wrote it," I said. "Admiral Cole drew it." The translator conveyed this. Sethek made a small gesture, a tilt of the head, or something that the translator's behavior analysis tagged as the equivalent of a nod. Then Sethek spoke for a long time. Slowly, carefully, pausing often so the translator could work. I sat still and listened. They told me about the Drenethi. Not in the way the briefing file had told me, not as data, not as history, but in the way people speak about things they have lived through. Sethek used the phrase, the before, twice, which the translator flagged as a culturally significant compound term with no direct universal equivalent. I did not ask what it meant. I understood what it meant. They talked about the 11 years of dissolution. The way the conclave had done it, not through direct engagement, but through the slow, methodical removal of legal standing, resource access, and diplomatic recognition. One system at a time. One piece of infrastructure at a time. The Drenethi had been dissolved like a problem being solved, not like a civilization being challenged. By the time they had understood what was happening, it was already mostly done. I was tracing the grain of the table with my thumbnail. I noticed I was doing it. I did not stop. Sethek paused. Then they asked, with no diplomatic framing and no preamble, in 8 words of their own Universal Galactic, "Did you know it would work?" The room was very quiet. I had spent the better part of 3 days giving carefully considered answers to carefully considered questions. I had managed uncertainty, assessed risk, and represented Terran Command's position with precision. I was good at this. It was what I was for. I said, "No." A beat. Its own space. We drew the line anyway. Sethek looked at me. For a long moment they did not speak. The translator was still. The aide behind Sethek was still. I was still, with my thumbnail against the table grain and the pen clipped to my breast pocket and 4 million people on the other side of a boundary I had entered as coordinates on a screen at 0300 in a room with a dead overhead light. Then Sethek said something to the translator, and the translator said, "This is what the before felt like." Before we stopped. I did not answer that. There was no answer that would not diminish it. We sat in the quiet for a moment. It was not an uncomfortable quiet. It was the kind that comes after something true has been said in a room and both people in it understand that speaking further would be a kind of loss. I said, "What do the Drenethi need from this?" Sethek spoke. The translator said, "To see if holding is possible. We need to know if it is possible." We did not know. We stopped before we knew. "I understand," I said. "We want to observe," the translator said. Not as allies, we have nothing left to offer as allies. As witnesses. If the line holds, we want to be witnesses. I looked at them. The large eyes that processed light in 2 frequencies. The clothing that had been functional once. The 8 working words of Universal Galactic. You are already witnessing it, I said. After the meeting ended and Sethek and the 8 had gone, I sat in the empty conference room for 11 minutes. This was unusual for me. I did not sit still as a habit. I moved, I worked, I filed things and drafted things and assessed things. I had learned a long time ago that stillness was where the things you were not thinking about found you. I sat for 11 minutes. Then I went to the tactical console in my quarters and pulled up the line status display. The boundary coordinates I had entered, the 14 points I had named in the dark, the last sentence that nobody had asked me to write. The Conclave fleet was still 40 light minutes out. Still regrouping. The sensor shadows I had noted 3 days ago had resolved into confirmed vessels. The reinforcement group was 400 ships now, and growing. The tactical estimate for full second wave deployment was 8 to 12 cycles. We had 8 to 12 cycles. I opened a new document. Not a report. Not a draft. Something without a form, notes, really, or the closest thing I allowed myself to notes. I wrote, the Drenathi stopped before they knew if holding was possible. We will find out if holding is possible. Whatever the answer is, they will be witnesses to it. I stopped writing. The pen was on the desk. I had stopped noticing when I took it out of my pocket. It was just where it was now, beside the terminal, beside the cold coffee, beside the 8 to 12 cycles I had to figure out how to make into something other than an end. I picked it up. Not to write. Just to hold it. The alert came at 0412. Not a proximity warning this time. An engagement signal, the specific 2-tone pattern that meant vessels had crossed the line and were actively closing. No holding position. No demonstration. Closing. I was dressed and moving before the second tone. The Meridian's bridge smelled the same as it had at Proxima, recycled air, burnt coffee, the ionized wrong smell of weapon arrays at full power. But this time the smell was stronger. This time the weapon arrays were not cycling up for readiness. They were already at maximum output, and the sound underneath the alert was the deep frequency vibration of the Meridian's own systems pushing to their limits. Cole was at the central display. His coffee cup was there too, full and untouched. He had stopped pretending to drink it. 1,430 vessels, he said. They are not holding position. I looked at the display. The red markers were not sitting on the line. They were moving through it, past it, into sovereign Terran space in a coordinated spread formation, the Conclave's standard engagement pattern, optimized over 2,000 years of practice against opponents who were not, historically, still there by the end of the engagement. Our fleet, 22 ships. We had pulled in 4 additional vessels since Proxima. I did not look at Ro. He did not look at me. We had both done the math. We had both arrived at the same place and agreed, without speaking, not to live there. Owen was at the communications board. His hands were steady. He was 23 years old and he was frightened and he was present, which was the only thing anyone can offer when the moment arrives. Open all tactical channels, Cole said. And activate the maze. The maze. I had written its deployment parameters into the line protocol's enforcement addendum, 2 sentences, buried in subsection 7, that the Conclave's intelligence services had either missed or discounted as a bluff. The maze was not a weapons system in the conventional sense. It was a navigational disruption network, a series of interlocked gravitational pulse arrays positioned at key transit corridors throughout the outer rim, designed with one purpose, to make the space inside Terran sovereign territory a problem that could not be solved by simply having more ships. The Conclave fleet was large. The maze did not care about large. It cared about formation. About coordination. About the precise, 2,000-year-old pattern of engagement that worked against opponents who were not also reshaping the tactical geometry of the space around them in real time. On the display, I watched the Conclave formation begin to fracture. Not dramatically. Not all at once. The leading vessels hit the first pulse arrays and their navigational systems registered the disruption and they compensated, which was what they were designed to do, and their compensation pulled them slightly out of formation, which was what the maze was designed to cause. A slightly fractured formation communicated differently with its rear components. The rear components adjusted. Their adjustment pulled them further out of alignment with the flanks. The flanks corrected. The correction compounded the fracture. It was, technically, a precise and ruthless mechanism. Every part doing exactly what it was made to do. Rowe said, "Coalition contacts, bearing 220, 315, and 047. In the 72 hours after Proxima and the 6 cycles following our diplomatic meetings, 6 species had made the calculation I had mentioned to Cole, not because they loved humanity, but because they had run their own numbers and decided that standing on the right side of this particular line was better than the alternative. They were not large forces. They were not coming to win the engagement for us. They were coming to make the Conclave's navigation problem considerably worse, and they were very good at that specific thing. The battle was not a clean thing. I want to be accurate about this. It was fast and it was terrible, and there were moments when the tactical display showed things I filed away in the part of my mind that handles information which requires later processing. We lost 3 ships. The TSNS Callaway, the TSNS Heron, and the patrol vessel Bright Line, 61 crew on the Callaway, 48 on the Heron, 12 on the Bright Line. 121 people. I noted the names and continued. The maze held. The coalition flanks held. The Meridian itself took 2 direct hits that shook the bridge hard enough to send 2 officers to the floor and cracked the display casing on Owen's board, which he repaired with the flat of his hand and kept running. The Ares-class weapon systems were doing what they had been built to do against an opponent that had never faced them before. And the Conclave fleet, for all of its 1,430 vessels and its 2,000 years of engaged practice and its flat-voiced certainty about outcomes, was inside the maze. At 0614, the first Conclave formation began pulling back. Not the full fleet. The lead formation, approximately 200 vessels that had pushed deepest into sovereign Terran space and found themselves navigationally isolated and under coordinated fire from 3 directions. They pulled back to the line perimeter and stopped. At 0641, a second formation followed. At 0712, a third. At 0748, 3 hours and 36 minutes after the engagement signal had sounded, the last Conclave vessel crossed back over the line and the display's red markers were entirely outside Terran sovereign space. The bridge was very quiet. Not the waiting quiet of the standoff. Something else. Something that moved through the room like a change in air pressure, not loud, not triumphant, just a collective exhale from 412 people who had spent 3 hours and 36 minutes in a controlled state of emergency and were now in the first moment of something that did not yet have a name. Someone, somewhere down the corridor on the deck below, made a sound. Someone else responded. It grew into something that was not quite a cheer, too rough-edged, too exhausted, too real for that, but that occupied the same space a cheer would occupy. I stood at the secondary tactical console and looked at the display. The pen was in my hand. Both halves of it. I had not noticed when it broke, sometime in the last 3 hours, sometime between the first hit on the Meridian and the third formation's retreat. I had snapped it clean through the middle without registering the action. The ink had left a faint blue line across my palm. I held both halves and looked at the display and the red markers outside the line and the 3 gaps in our fleet formation where the Callaway and the Heron and the Bright Line had been. Owen's voice, "Commander." I looked up. He was across the bridge, standing half out of his chair, one hand still on the communications board because he had not yet permitted himself to fully stop working. He was 23 years old and he was still slightly frightened, and he was looking at me with the expression of someone who had a sentence ready and was checking to make sure it was safe to say it. "Commander," he said. "We won." The room that had not quite cheered held still for a moment. I looked at him. He was so young. He would remember this day for the rest of his life. I knew that with certainty, looking at his face. Whatever came after, wherever he went, whatever he did with the years he had, this would be one of the fixed points. The morning of 0412. The Meridian's bridge. The display with its red markers retreating across the line. I wanted to give him the right thing. I held the 2 halves of the pen and I found the word in my chest where it had been sitting for 3 hours and 36 minutes like a stone waiting to decide which way to fall. "Yeah," I said. A beat. We did. I meant it. It took me a moment to mean it, and then I meant it completely. The bridge found its voice. Owen's hand came off the communications board. Ro, at the weapons console, turned around for the first time in hours, and the expression on his face was one I had never seen on him before, not relief, not something loud, but the face of a person who has been prepared to pay a full price and has not been asked to pay all of it. Cole was at the central display. He had his back to the room. He was looking at the tactical readout, the Conclave fleet's current positioning, the retreat vectors, the maze's status, the 3 empty formation slots. Doing the next calculation. Already inside the next moment. He did not turn around for the celebration. He did not need to. I crossed to him. He said, without looking away from the display, "They will want terms within 72 hours. I know. The legal framework is going to be complicated. The Outer Rim settlement recognition, the Drenethi status question, the coalition agreements." "I know," I said. He looked at me then. Whatever he saw in my face, the broken pen in my hand, the ink line across my palm, whatever the last few hours had cost that was visible from the outside, he held it quietly for a moment. The way Cole held most things. With the specific weight of someone who understood that the people around him were not resources. They were people, with costs and histories and things they kept in their pockets. He said, "Good work, Yael." 2 words. No elaboration. He meant them both. He went back to his display. I went to my station. I set both halves of the pen down on the surface of the console, parallel, careful, like placing something down that you intended to pick up again. The ink mark on my palm was fading at the edges. I looked at it. Orvane's fleet was 40 light minutes past the line. Not regrouping this time. Moving. Retreating, or withdrawing, which was what the Conclave would call it, and I was not going to argue the language. The distinction mattered to them. Fine. Let them have the language. We had the line. Owen appeared at my elbow. He set a fresh cup of coffee on the edge of my console, still steaming, which I noted with genuine appreciation, and looked at the 2 halves of the pen without asking. "Supply room is on deck 4, he said. "They have about 100 of those." "I know where the supply room is." "Just saying." I looked at him. 6 months out of the academy. Titan-born. First deployment. He had watched the whole thing from the communications board, and he had kept his hands steady and his board running, and he had asked me one question that deserved an honest answer, and I had given him one. He was going to be good at this. I picked up the coffee. Still hot. I held it with both hands and looked at the display and the line and the space beyond it where the red markers were moving away. Later, after the after-action reports, after the coalition debriefs, after the first round of legal frameworks and the preliminary contact from Orvane's diplomatic team, which was measured and formal and, for the first time in the history of our 2 species, requesting rather than declaring, after the 100 things that follow a battle when the battle is over, I went to my quarters. I put both halves of the pen on my desk. I opened the drawer and took out a new pen. Standard issue, military gray. Identical in every way to the one that was now in 2 pieces beside it. I held it for a moment. Then I put it back in the drawer. I went to the supply room on deck 4 and I took a pen from the shelf, standard issue, military gray, and I walked back to my quarters and I set it next to the broken one. I sat down. I opened the mission log and I found the last entry I had written during the standoff, and I looked at the line I had almost deleted. "We are good at this." I left it. Then I started writing the post-engagement report. The stone in my chest, the unnamed thing that had settled there when Owen said we won and I had taken a moment to mean it, was still there. Not smaller. Not resolved. Still sitting in its own space, still carrying whatever it was carrying. I was not going to name it tonight. Tonight there were reports to write and terms to draft and 121 names to add to a record that already had too many names on it. There was a Drenethi envoy somewhere in Terran Command HQ who was, at this moment, witnessing exactly what they had come to witness. There were 6 coalition species recalculating what this meant for them and their own lines, their own boundaries, their own decisions about what they were willing to hold. There was the line, still there, still holding, drawn in coordinates named for people who were not here to see it hold. That was enough for tonight. I wrote.